Hello, everyone. Professor Sitaraman, Professor Wu, invited guests, and welcome students. I'm incredibly proud to have the honor of introducing our event today, where we're going to discuss not only Ganesh's incredible book, but also the animus that really brings it to life. This is the latest in Columbia LP's series on markets, where we discuss problems in political economy and how to solve them. I want to start by noting that Ganesh's book is brilliant, and it's brilliant because it touches on problems that are so implicitly obvious to all of us. I'm sure everyone in this room has felt frustration with an airline. Categorically, it feels like air travel has somehow gotten even worse. We're offered less space and stuffed amidst more seats. We're given less food and charged more fees. We're extended longer delays and offered less destinations. Everything that should have grown has shrunk, and everything that should have shrunk has grown. Our planes have inverted, and too often it feels like we're flying upside down. And these problems with civil aviation seem emblematic of larger problems with our own country. All over, our infrastructure feels dysfunctional, and our technology ancient. And the conventional interpretation of this fact is that these are somehow merely automatic inconveniences in ancient and eroding industries. But of course, this isn't true. Aviation isn't an ancient field, it's a young one. In fact, for most of human history, it wasn't believed that manned flight could even be accomplished. Icarus plummeted precisely because he dared to fly. Nor was this just an ancient prejudice. As recently as 1897, the Washington Post definitively concluded it is a fact that man cannot fly. Well, if that was a fact, it wasn't a fact that the Wright brothers found very convincing. And 6 years later, they emerged from the dunes of Kitty Hawk, half men, half birds. And for much of the 20th century, America, the nation that was the first to spread its wings, made dramatic progress on all frontiers of flight. We saw advances by Argonauts, astronauts, and aviators. We watched great people rise up from our earthly star, people like Lindbergh, Hughes, and Armstrong. We built aircraft carriers and launched Americans into space. These were years of progress and plenty. These were years of pride. But something terrible has happened in the intervening years. We've lost our way. Plans have become ambitions, ambitions have become dreams. Supersonic has slipped into subsonic, and subsonic has slipped into stagnation. And in December, 120 years after Kitty Hawk, too many American passengers will have their flights canceled, delayed, and downed. Sometimes it feels as if the Washington Post had it right the first time. Maybe men can't fly. But I hope no one in this assemblage would agree with that sentiment. We can fly. We've long since accomplished the technical challenge, and all we have today is a political economy problem, a problem that can be solved by the leaders in this room, a problem, perhaps, with answers in this book. Indeed, this book often reminds me of those words from Tennyson. Some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Thank you so much. Everyone join me in welcoming our two distinguished professors.
Well, that's always a hard act to follow, Suresh, but thank you for the introduction. I'm going to lead our discussion today. I'm Tim Wu from here at the law school, and obviously Ganesh, the author, is with us. I wanted to mention that the books are available outside from Book Culture, who has come up with a big bundle of them if you wish to buy them. There may also possibly be my book there as well, but by the same publisher, Columbia Global Reports. So, Ganesh, why don't we get right into it? You know a lot about a lot of things. You've talked and taught about a lot of topics. What inspired you to write this book?
So I'm someone who flies a lot. And I think like anybody who flies a lot, I've had my share of frustrations and miseries with the airline industry. But like Tim, like you, I'm also a law professor, and I write a lot about economic policy and regulation. And so I was working on a textbook with some colleagues, and I was writing the airline regulation chapter. And as I dug into the history of airline policy and law, what I realized was that all the things just about that make flying miserable, frustrating, irritating, problematic, challenging are a function of public policy choices. And the biggest public policy choice in this area was the decision to deregulate the airlines in 1978. And so when I was doing this work, it just struck me that this is a story I think people don't really know. They don't know how we got to where we are today, what really happened. And that's what I try to uncover in the book.
Why don't you tell us a little bit of that story, so if people haven't read the book yet, My understanding of it, I haven't read the book, but the very brief ideas of course, airlines were new, or airplanes were new. Obviously not regulated at the very beginning, and then there became to be a regulatory system, which was then undone in the late 70s. So why don't you walk us through that story a little bit?
Yeah, so if we put aside those early years from the Wright brothers into the 1920s, there are really a few big eras in our history as a country in dealing with airline policy. The first is from the 1930s to the 1970s, and I like to think of this as the era of stable, reliable service. And what Congress wanted to do in the 1930s was ensure that we had air travel everywhere in the country, because they saw it as a critical transportation infrastructure that was important to linking small places, medium places, in what's geographically a gigantic space that we have. And they also wanted to make sure that the airline business would be competitive, but not so competitive that the airlines would all go bankrupt or need subsidies, and not so uncompetitive that they would become monopolies or an oligopoly in any city or overall. And so they created a federal regulatory agency called the Civil Aeronautics Board, and they tasked them with managing a system of regulated competition in which the Civil Aeronautics Board, or the CAB, allocated routes to specific airlines to fly from one place to another. So some airlines, as an airline, you would get some routes that were to low volume places like Alaska, and some that were on high volume routes too. They also regulated the prices of airlines in the early days to try to wean the airlines off of government subsidies. And then ultimately, they tied prices mostly to distance. So the longer the distance you flew, the more you paid. And that system worked reasonably well through that time period. There were challenges, certainly, but during that period, more and more people were flying. Prices were going down consistently. And there were some big innovations, like the shift from propellers planes to jets, from jets to wide-bodied jets. And then by the 1970s, real competition over service, actually, including some kind of crazy service competition, at least as we might think of it today. My favorite example is that there were actually piano bars in some airplanes, not in the airports, in the airplanes themselves. And I don't know where you could fit a piano now in an airplane, but...
I looked at some of the pictures, and I know you say it's crazy, but I was looking at the economy class, like American Airlines lounge, and on the airplane, it looked pretty good. It made me feel like our civilization has kind of gone downhill or something like that. But what drove the impetus for change and towards deregulation that I think you're going to say follows?
Yeah, so I think there were a few things. The first was there was a real economic crisis in the 1970s, a combination of high inflation, oil prices, demand went down for passenger travel. So there was this economic context that shifted. The second thing was there was a set of intellectual shifts that happened in that time period, largely driven by economists who said that airlines were not a kind of public utility, a critical infrastructure. They weren't a different kind of business. They were like all other kinds of businesses, and as a result should operate like other businesses in a kind of competitive system. And that the system we had of regulated competition, they said, was more like a cartel, and that's bad, and we should get rid of cartels. And so their pitch was, we could have a much better system if we just let airlines fly wherever they want, whenever they want, and to charge whatever they want.
Can I interrupt you? When you say they, who was the they in this case?
So it's a really interesting group of people making this pitch. It's a mix of some conservatives who, maybe predictably were against big government or regulation. But a lot of the real driving forces were actually liberals, a combination of consumer advocates like Ralph Nader, and also kind of classic old school liberals like Ted Kennedy and his main advisor at the time, later Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer. And so this combination of liberals and conservatives, economists pushing this idea that if we deregulated the industry, we could have dozens of airlines operating competitively. One person even suggested up to 200 airlines operating competitively, and there would be no real downsides in this system. And so that was their pitch, and it was a good pitch. And so Congress took it up, and in 1978 deregulated the industry.
What was the most charitable version you can give? I know you think deregulation has not gone as hoped. But what is the most charitable version you think of goal or what they thought they would accomplish. I'm saying Senator Kennedy and Stephen Breyer, when they thought, what were they hoping would happen?
I think the most charitable way we could think about this is that they thought that if we massively increased the amount of competition and the number of players in the airline industry, we would get lower prices because there would be more competition, and we wouldn't lose that much in terms of the quality of service or the locations of service or congestion or any of the other downsides that we've seen over the decades. I think the challenge with that was, in a lot of ways, their assumptions about the industry weren't right. Right. And a lot of the people who pushed for deregulation, or maybe not a lot, but some at least, who pushed for deregulation admitted this years later, that they had been wrong in their understanding of the industry in critical ways, and that as a result didn't predict what happened afterwards.
Yeah, so I guess you tell us a saga. I take it as of relatively well-meaning people. Like, I don't think you think this was an evil conspiracy to make seats smaller, unless I'm wrong about that, but that it didn't go as well. And one of the things you say in your book, you say that the American tradition of regulated capitalism was built on the understanding that some sectors of the economy were not like others. What was it maybe that they got wrong, or what makes the airline industry different than other industries?
Yeah, so this idea goes back really hundreds of years in American law and policy, that some areas of business are different than others. And the reason they're different is because they're unlikely to be very competitive. And so in some areas, you have really high capital costs, which just means it's expensive to get into the business. There are network effects or economies of scale, which basically means that the bigger you are, the better off you are. And the more of a network you have, the better off you are. Easy example of that is a telephone would not be useful at all if there's no one else who has one, if you're the only person who has one. But if that network is really big, the bigger it is, the more valuable it is because you can call more people, right? So that's a kind of a network effect. Some areas have barriers to entry. It's hard to get into the business. You can't just start an airline, it turns out. You also have to have a place to land. There are a limited number of airports. There are a limited number of runways, limited number of gates. And we can't have everybody landing at once. You could have 100 restaurants on the same street. We're here in New York. There are really long streets. There are lots of restaurants on them. They can all compete with each other. You can't have 100 different airlines landing their plane at the same time on the same runway. They will crash into each other. This is a real problem. It's a constraint. So there are these barriers that come up as well. And what people understood for a long time is in these industries, you're highly likely to get either a monopoly or an oligopoly, which is just an economistic way of saying a small number of companies, not just one, who are dominant. And in those systems, you need a different kind of regulation to prevent all the bads that come from the concentration of power into a very, very small number of firms. And so that's why they thought regulation was necessary. Right. And what the deregulators said was actually, they were wrong about some of this, but they didn't think there were economies of scale in the airline industry. They didn't really take seriously network effects. They thought that this was an area that didn't really have barriers to entry and that anyone could just start an airplane. And I think when you read some of their comments from then, they are well-meaning. But it just sounds, when you read them now, it seems shocking how wrong they were.
Right. So, I take it from your business. We have the title of your book, Why Flying is Miserable. So I take it you don't feel this was a great success, the deregulatory. And you've said some of what the assumptions were wrong, but what really went wrong when in practice? What's gone wrong over the last 40 years or whatever time period you want?
Yeah, so what happened after the Deregulation Act in 1978 is we didn't end up in this dream world of competition where everything was better. We actually ended up in something more like the Hunger Games. It was a, I mean, you're right, it was a cutthroat period of competition right away where there were a lot of new entrants coming in. There were airlines called New York Air and People Express, and they were offering really cheap fares, no frills, no meals, just peanuts. That's how we got to peanuts on airlines. There was a campaign called Just Peanuts. That's what the fares were. And they came in not on those low volume routes flying to Alaska or to rural places, but in high volume places where they could make, a lot of volume and make money. And for these airlines that were coming in, trying to really undercut the big guys on cost, at first that seemed like a good thing. Right. But the big airlines fought back, and they had a lot of weapons that they could use too in this Hunger Games. And that meant pricing even below the new upstarts. It meant sandwiching flights. So, imagine you have a flight at 10 a.m. as a new airline. The big airline would come in and have a flight at 9:58 and 10:02 going to the same place. And who wants to fly the airline that has so few flights when you could fly the bigger airline for cheaper, with better service, and where there's more flights per day? But that meant the smaller airlines went out of business, and so you had dozens of bankruptcies, mergers in this period. And by the end of the 80s, we have reconsolidation back into the same big airlines that were dominant in the regulated period, but just without regulation. And so that was that era. And I think what's happened over the decades is we've gotten even more concentration. So I would say now we're in something like a period of monopolistic capitalism where you really have very, very little competition, deep concentration in the industry, not just overall, where the top 4 airlines have a larger market share than they did in the 1970s, but also concentration at airports. So, in some airports in the 1970s, you have 20% of the airport would be one airline. That would be the most dominant. Now it's 70%. It's huge amounts. So there's less competition even if you're flying to specific places. And that's to some big cities, Atlanta, Dallas, Charlotte. And so I think that's where we are now, a place where we have few choices.
Well, let me try and pin you down on this, on how you feel about competition, because I feel it's a key question. I feel many members of our audience, or people watching, might naturally, instinctively think that competition in airlines is good. If you have one carrier on a route or 2 carriers, they're going to match prices, charge whatever they can get away with. So, I think the sense that competition might be bad is very counterintuitive. So I guess I'm trying, and the Justice Department right now is trying to stop a merger between JetBlue and Spirit Airlines on the basis that it would destroy competition. So I guess I'm trying to pin you down exactly what you're saying about competition. Too much competition bad? Too much? Where are you really on airline competition?
Yeah, so this really goes back to this distinction where some businesses are different than others. If we're thinking about making coffee mugs or a restaurant, you can have competition where we could expect there might be dozens of restaurants, hundreds of restaurants even, in a city that's big enough. And they can all compete with each other. But in these sectors where there's a move toward consolidation, to have competition really requires a fair bit of regulation in order to maintain it. And that's what we had in the regulated period. There was competition. It was regulated competition, but it was competition.
Right.
We actually have less competition now than we did then because we deregulated. And so you don't, in these areas, your choice isn't open competition or regulation. It's actually regulated competition or massive consolidation and no competition.
Right.
And that's because of these underlying economic dynamics. And so to me, the question is not, can we just have competition without regulation? It's that in these sectors, if you want any kind of competition, you also need regulation to make sure that can happen.
Now, you've painted a somewhat positive picture of the 70s, 60s and 70s. But I feel like I often come across, writings or people saying that, the problem was in the old days, it was just so expensive, and the Civil Aviation Aeronautics Board determined prices per mile. It was kind of central planning, sort of like Soviet style, and that's why you had these piano bars and too much going on. And, flying might be miserable right now, but at least we have free prices, and you can have an airline like Spirit, which gives you absolutely nothing, but is rock bottom. Although they are being bought by JetBlue, but whatever. You have this freedom in prices. So what do you say to the critics who say, those were the bad old days? That's when it was expensive and only available to the richest Americans.
It's a great point. One of the things you hear from a lot of people is, well, prices went down after deregulation. And it's true. If you look at the chart starting in 1978, you'll see prices going down consistently. Now, if you move that chart back to 1950, you'll see prices going down consistently the whole time at just about the same rate. And so there's this thing where airline deregulation didn't actually lead to a kind of massive drop in prices, average prices overall. We had declining prices over time. And this partly makes sense because, as our introducer said, airlines are not an ancient industry. This is a new industry. And even in the 1950s, before the FAA, which was created, the Federal Aviation Administration, created in the late 1950s, there were a lot of safety challenges. I mean, there were plane crashes that were happening, mid-air plane crashes. And so that is a thing that deters people from flying. So you got more volume as we had safer airplanes, you had more growth in the industry, you had cheaper costs over time. And we've seen that pretty consistently as things go on. So I do think, yes, there were higher prices, but prices were going down that whole time, continued going down afterwards. To the other points about the bad old days and the good new days of price competition, I find it a little bit of a weird argument because I've actually never met a person who said to me, I just love that I paid extra to pick my seat. It was amazing when I paid more to check my bag. Didn't you just have a great experience with paying them more for checking your bag? I had a great one with that. No one says that. People actually don't like the system that we have. They don't like the smaller seats. They don't like when you have a plane that has lots of seats in it, but they say when you're about to board, well, we only have space for 20 bags in the overhead compartment, so you're all going to have to check your bags here. Nobody likes that.
Yeah.
And the challenge is, you can't fix it by saying, I'm not going to fly, because if you need to go from Nashville, where I live, to New York, and you want to get there to come to Columbia to give a talk, I'm not going to walk. It takes too long, and driving takes too long. You need to fly, and if you don't have many choices, the market's not going to discipline that, and that's where the competition stuff comes into play again, too.
You did fly here. Did you have to
I
pay
flew,
for?
yeah. I'm doing a bunch of different book events and flying between them.
Yeah. So maybe you can pick up.
On my first flight, as we started this book tour, we were actually delayed by more than an hour. So I took that to be an appropriate start for this tour.
Yes, it would be a sad thing if your flights all end up getting canceled and can't promote your book. It'd be like a conspiracy. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about about bailouts? And one of the things you write about in the book is the pattern that the airlines seem to have established of, when crisis strikes, turning to the federal government for money. I think most recently during COVID, I can't remember the number, but was it over $50 billion during COVID on the condition that they, I think, not lay anybody off. But why don't you tell us about the bailout pattern?
Yeah, so one thing that's happened since deregulation is we've moved into a system where the industry is really in this kind of boom and bust cycle.
Yeah.
There are eras where the airline industry is making money hand over fist, the 90s, the 2010s. In fact, in the late 2010s, one airline executive said that he didn't think they'd ever lose money again.
Right.
But then there are these crises, these big demand shocks where people don't want to fly, 9/11,
Right.
COVID. And in those moments, the airlines come to Congress and they say, we need help. We need a bailout after 9/11. We need a payroll support program after COVID. And so we have this situation, which is not unlike banking almost, where the airlines are too important to fail. They are in a place where if we don't rescue the airlines when they're in crisis, they may lay off thousands of people, which is not only devastating for those people, and it definitely would be, but it also means that when demand comes back up and when people want to fly, there won't be people to fly the planes or to service the planes or to be flight attendants or other employees who work in the industry. And you can't just start a job in the airline industry. They can't just hire somebody off the street. To be a pilot, you actually have to learn how to fly a plane. And you have to have a lot of hours doing that so you can do it safely. And so there's a lot of skill and training in a whole bunch of these jobs that mean you can't just pop back up when there's more demand. And so to me, in a way, this is real proof that this is an industry that is a kind of public utility. Because it's so important, we have to rescue it in these crises moments.
Right.
That's not true of a lot of other businesses. It is true of the airlines because of their systemic importance. And so what happened in the COVID situation is exactly this. The airlines are in a place where they're going to have to lay off lots of people. And so we passed this package, which I think is very important to saving those jobs, to preventing this big crisis that we would have had. But the airlines kind of skirt the spirit of the law also while offering voluntary retirement packages. And so last year we still did see shortages and cancellations and delays and fewer flights than we needed because of this. They didn't bounce back with the kind of bounce that we needed.
I think one of the things that struck me is you said they didn't fire anybody. They said they wouldn't fire anyone in exchange for how much was it? 50?
Yeah, it was
$54 billion, and then they said they wouldn't fire anybody, but they found ways to have people retire anyway. So they didn't have the staff when they needed it, which struck me, I think, as you have said. But, it struck me when I think about that bailout, weren't the airlines extraordinarily profitable over the 2010s, partially through the baggage fees and change fees? if memory serves, they'd made billions of dollars, in fact, become a very profitable industry. But why didn't they keep that money for lean times? Or what happened to that money that was made during the 2010s when they were the most profitable, such they would need so much money when things went down?
So instead of having a kind of rainy day fund for when there was a big crisis, there were things like stock buybacks instead. And that meant there's less money available for when the crisis hits.
Do you have a sense of how much stock buyback?
I can pull it out in the book off the top of my head, but I talk about it in the book with all the numbers.
Combined of almost 100 billion. I should not get the numbers wrong, but I was shocked when I remember looking into that at some point. Let me ask you about the contemporary business model. So you've said a few things. They're reliant on government bailouts. Innovation in the industry has gone left towards building supersonic jets or faster or more convenient, into trying to figure out how to shrink seats and squeeze more of them into an airplane. That's been like intense focus. But you also write about, this is a quote from your book, that airlines have learned from Wall Street that finance can be more profitable than industry, and that airlines now operate like banks. I'm curious what you meant by that.
Yeah, so if anybody has a airline branded credit card, in a way, you know what I mean. These card programs are no longer like your local coffee shop or sandwich shop where you buy 10 sandwiches and get the 11th one free. They're not frequent flyer programs really anymore. They're actually credit card spending programs where it's really about how much money you spend, not about how much you fly. And what's happened over time as that's evolved over the decades is the airlines have created these systems where they create all these points really out of thin air. They work with credit cards. The credit cards make money off of swipe fees from the retailers. And for the airlines, it's a great deal. You want to fly on their airline more rather than flying on their competitors. So in that sense, it's anti-competitive. And people in the 80s actually were very upset about this. They thought this was a real anti-competitive move when they created these programs. But it's also a place where they have a lot of flexibility over how these points systems work. They can devalue the points. So maybe today, using points to fly somewhere costs 30,000 points, but maybe tomorrow it costs 50,000. Well, those points that you've accrued are now worth less when you try to redeem them. And so I think what we've seen is, as those point systems have changed, in some ways, that's another place for airlines to be able to kind of work with credit card companies and banks to make more money and to keep more business, even though it may not always be better for passengers or consumers.
You make the points sound more like a cryptocurrency than sort of a reward program. You sort of issue more, you downgrade, upgrade them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, there's this odd thing because they're created by the airlines, right? And that's, usually when we think of something that's like a currency, it's created by the state, by a government. And even in our banking system, that's how it works. I mean, the government is the one that creates sovereign money, and we just outsource that process to operate through banks, and that's how our banking system works. Yeah. But this is very different, where the airlines have just created this effectively currency, and they decide what you can spend it on.
Does this help explain some of the downgrading that everyone got very upset about this fall at Delta and maybe other airlines, where they've given up on miles as the,
Exactly, yeah. So earlier this fall, Delta explained that they were going to change their program, make it harder to get some of the best levels of status, and then also downgrade some of what you get for your status. And so people were pretty upset about this. The head of Delta then backtracked a little bit, not totally, but a little bit, amidst the outcry. But they're still moving in that same direction.
One last thing about the contemporary business model before we move to solutions, which is you write in the book also about the issue of common ownership, horizontal shareholding. There's which further, I think you suggest, affects competition with the airlines. Can you explain what that's about?
Yeah, so there have been some studies from economists that show that when there are shareholders in common for multiple different businesses, and this is called common ownership, that the businesses don't need to actually collude. The CEOs don't have to call each other up and say, hey, how about you raise your prices tomorrow and I'll raise my prices tomorrow. They don't have to do that. They understand that because their ownership is similar, it's actually beneficial for them to not compete as much, and that implicitly you get the same kind of anti-competitive effects because it's as if they're owned by the same entity. And so there's economists who've shown that this raises prices. There's law professors who have argued that this is a violation of the antitrust laws. And I think this is another aspect of what's happened in this industry that moves us in this direction of more monopolistic capitalism.
So, sorry to interrupt you. So the idea is that because, say American Airlines and United actually have the same owners at some level, they're just not as interested in really trying to compete with each other. It's kind of like pretending to compete.
That's the idea that, and if you think about it, it sort of makes sense. We can simplify the example and say if one entity owned two different airlines, 100% of the ownership of two airlines, why would they want to compete with each other? Because they would be competing away their own profits and gains.
Who are these entities that own all the airlines?
So big
at once?
institutional investors, yeah.
Yeah, like BlackRock and so on. And Vanguard, which some of us may own here. All right, well, why don't we turn to solutions before we take possible solutions. Now, you say in the book, you propose, you have a number of possibilities that you throw out there, which range, I guess, from the bigger to the smaller. So one is you propose one possibility is to embrace the fact that the airline industry tends towards consolidation. Thus, you suggest or think it's a possibility that air travel should possibly even be a nationalized monopoly or some kind of single system. Now, many people sort of reflexively think monopolies are bad things. So I'm curious about that as a possible solution.
Yeah, so part of my goal in the book was to try to expand our imagination for how we think about regulating airlines. And not just focus on, well, we need a passenger's bill of rights with a laundry list of 15 things that we're upset about. Because if we do that, what we'll end up with is next year there'll be some other thing we're upset about, and then the year after something else, and we'll be playing this whack-a-mole game of trying to fix all these little things. And so I want us to think bigger, and some of the first ideas I explore, I think, are probably infeasible in the United States, but exist in other countries. And the idea is to take seriously these questions that some businesses are different than others. And if we really cared about efficiency and scale and network effects, then the most efficient, biggest scale, biggest network approach would just be to have one airline. I don't think we're going to do that in the United States, but we could. It would be a possibility. Some countries have national carriers. In the past, in the United States, we've had a single provider. The Bell system in the telephone industry was one of these in the mid-20th century, and that was a regulated private company. So we have this model that exists in some places. But one of the downsides, of course, to a unified actor is you don't have any competition. And you might expect there could be less innovation. There could be more sclerosis in the entity. And so to me, I then moved to a number of solutions of how we might think about
in a second, but just playing with this nationalized monopoly, there is, Amtrak is that way. Are there countries that have a single carrier and don't have other carriers where that has worked well?
Yeah, so I was talking to somebody, there's lots of different models around the country, around the world, and one of the challenges is that there are different consequences in the different models. And in some places, I was talking to someone yesterday who said, I've taken state-run carriers in some countries and others, and some of them are the best flights I've ever taken in my whole life. Singapore Airlines, the person said they really liked. But other state-run carriers have been terrible experiences. And there's a challenge where in different countries we have different experiences with this. So I think it's hard to conclude one way or the other on just that fact.
And Singapore is a relatively small country.
I think that's partly one of the reasons why.
Yes. So some of the alternatives you talk about are a public option or regulated competition. Maybe you could talk how those would work out.
Yeah, so the public option idea says we should imagine a system where we take scale really seriously and we have a public provider and a private provider, just one of each. And Australia actually had a system like this before they deregulated their airline industry. It was called the two-airline policy, and they flew to similar places under similar terms. But the idea is the public option makes sure that the private actors aren't price gouging, and the private option makes sure that the public actors keep their quality of service up. And so you get some benefits of both, but with a lot of scale and not too much competition.
So you'd have sort of an Air America that's not a radio station or a radio network that flew run by the government, flying in competition, I guess, flying everywhere, flying everywhere. And they would, by their very existence, kind of force keep the private carriers honest. I guess that would be the vision. Now, I guess if the airline representatives were here, they'd say, well, that's not fair because they don't have to make a profit. They're supported by the government. They're, going to undercut us or, just provide unfair competition. I wonder what you'd say to that.
So, this goes back to the basic questions that we talked about earlier. How do we decide we want to organize competition in this industry? And you could devise a system in that case, in the Australian case where there are regulated rates. You could do that if you wanted to. You could also not do that and have more competition on prices. And I think the question is all really about the design. And you could imagine having quite profitable airlines in that context, private ones, and them competing with the public airline if you had, shared prices, but they would compete on service quality, for example.
Are there other places in America where you've ever used this public option idea?
Well, the thing that's interesting about public options is we actually have them everywhere in America. We just don't think of them that way. We think of healthcare as a place where there was a debate over public options, but there are public schools and there are private schools and there are public libraries and private libraries and public parks, and some people have a swing set in their backyard. There are public and private golf courses. There are public and private swimming pools, and we have public options all over, and people actually really like public libraries and public parks and all of these things too. So I think there's a lot of places where we do have things that work pretty well for a lot of people.
Maybe you can somehow have the National Park Service run the airline, and it would fly into the national parks, and you build the airlines, the airports and the national parks. You got the land, and I kind of see this coming together. You could fly to Yosemite, go skiing there for a while. I kind of like. Starting to begin to believe in Air America. You can run it. That'd be good. All right. Have I missed out on some of your other possible solutions? Public option, regulated competition?
Yeah, so to me, I think the place that's most feasible is for us to maintain a system of regulated competition. I think that's probably where we could actually make progress. And to me, there's really three principles that I think we should have as we think about policy in that direction. The first is no more flyover country. I don't think we should have a system where there are lots of parts of the country, including smaller and mid-sized cities, that don't have access to air travel. And that's where we are right now. 74 cities have lost major carrier service from one airline, at least since the pandemic. There are cities like Dubuque, Iowa, or Toledo, Ohio, that actually have 0 flights from one of the big 4 carriers. And I think this is a real problem. And so, one thing I propose in the book is that we think about a kind of NFL draft for geography where, there's a list of cities of all these places that might be a little bit lower volume, don't have as many flights right now, and the biggest airlines get to pick off the list, and we keep working through the list until everyone is served, and they have an obligation to serve those cities. My second principle is no bailouts, no bankruptcies. I actually want there to be a successful, profitable, stable, reliable airline industry. I don't think we should have this boom and bust system. And so one way we might think about doing that is actually have an obligation for airlines to have crisis management plans and rainy day funds where they have to think through what's going to happen if demand plummets for 6 months or a year, and how are we going to deal with that so we don't need to go to Congress and we don't need to ask for taxpayer support. And then I think the third principle I put forward in the book is fair and transparent pricing. And I think we need to have a much simpler system here where it's not the case that when you're sitting next to someone on a flight, you're wondering, did they actually pay half as much as I did for my ticket? And when you try to buy a ticket in the first place, you're not confronted with all of these different kinds of fare classes and different terms, junk fees, the kind of explosion of things that we've seen in recent years. I think we need a much simpler system on pricing.
Yeah, I keep thinking about this public option idea. I've gotten into it. I was thinking we do in some ways have already have a publicly operated set of airplanes, namely the military. And we do use, the United States government, when it needs people to get there, sometimes it gets the military involved. I remember once in the White House, we really needed baby formula, and we got a bunch of military airplanes to go get it from Europe or something like that. So you can imagine that maybe the Air Force, and obviously they have other business as well, but starting to fly people around. Anyway, I'm just getting into that idea. I don't think it's as crazy as, in other words, I'm encouraging you not to back off that one, because I think people might really like it. And as you said, there's a lot of public options that people love. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, you wrote an entire book on public options. Is that right?
I did, yeah.
Which I've always found very inspiring for things that are essential services and where, in some ways to make an argument for it, the airlines might say that, well, this isn't fair being backed by the government, but they're backed by the government too. Like they also are happy to dip into the differences that during the good times, they wouldn't be paying out dividends and buybacks and stuff like that. And it would be different, run with a different kind of set of principles, i.e., not try to make a profit.
Yeah, it'd be more about public service, which in a way is, I think, what this industry is. I mean, this is an essential transportation infrastructure for the country, and we should treat it that way.
Yeah. I guess I sort of asked you this, but of all the solutions you propose, which one do you think is sort of the best fit for our current political and regulatory environment, if you have to choose?
Well, I think in the short run, moving toward a system of regulated competition using the principles that I suggested, I think is hopefully the most viable. And the reason is because I think there are a lot of people around the country who could get on board with those principles. We have a system where luckily there are people in every state, in every congressional district who fly. There are people in a lot of red states who've lost service to their towns and communities. There's people in a lot of blue states who have, pay higher prices because they have hubs that are, concentrated. I think there's a real place where this could be a bipartisan area for compromise to actually expand service to places, prevent future bailouts or support programs, make pricing simpler for consumers. That's something that everyone should be able to get behind.
Well, you've given me hope about this. I want to leave some time for questions. Why don't you first join me in thanking and. Yes, and congratulating him. So why don't we take a few questions, and I see one over here.
Hello, thank you for being here with us. So my question is, in this industry, we see so many agreements between competitors from interline, code sharing, even JDs. What would you do in terms of those agreements that might be seen illicit in terms of network effects? From the regulatory standpoint or the antitrust enforcement standpoint?
Great question. So, I think one thing that's interesting, you mentioned interlining. This is actually an area where we've seen the airlines somewhat back off rather than cooperate. And so just to say what that is, interlining is the idea that if your flight's canceled or severely delayed and there's an extra spot on another airline, that you could fly on that airline. And the idea is that they have a deal on the back end to kind of work that out, but it allows you to get to where you're going on time, hopefully, or at least without being as delayed or as canceled. And this is a thing that happens a lot less actually now than it used to. So this is a place where they've moved away from that kind of relationship that could be better for travelers. I think on the other questions, one thing that we've seen is there's a lot of different airlines that have really consolidated into these systems, and there's different standards. So if you're flying an airline that looks like it's American, you might not actually be on American. It might be operated by a different airline, but they have a partnership and a deal. But there's sometimes different standards in pay for workers, for example. And those are places where I think we could do more to think about this as a system. And from a competition perspective, I think this goes really back to the basic questions I talked about before. I think it's a pretty unlikely we're going to get a system that the deregulators imagined with 200 airlines operating competitively. And so the question is, how do we get to a place where we have some more competition, but we make sure that that competition is real, which I think we don't really have right now.
I saw a question in the front here. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. All right. I think you can push a button and you turn on the mic.
I actually have two questions. One is, do you think that European regulations are any better in terms of maintaining the service? And two, where in this whole scheme of regulating airlines does the carbon offsetting footprint comes in? Because it almost looks like sometimes they just push onto the consumer, and we don't even know where that goes.
Yeah, so I'll just repeat because I think it might have been quiet. So the question was about Europe and whether they're essentially doing a better job, and a question about the carbon footprint. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so on the European question, the first thing that I'll say is, I'm a scholar of American regulation and policy, and so I don't want to go too far into parts that are not my kind of deep area of expertise. But I do think that one thing you see around the world is that deregulation or privatization happened in a lot of places. And this was a move that wasn't just in the United States, it was happening everywhere, and that really shifted things in a lot of different places. And so I think as we think about policy, we want to both look at how things work now, but also how things worked before in a lot of these different countries. And we might find that, as I mentioned earlier, things work differently in different places, and there may be other features. How much state capacity do you have to run a public service? How big are you? Are you Singapore or not? Do you have a huge geography that means you have to fly to lots of different places, or are you very small geography? These factors may matter quite a bit. And so I am hesitant to draw too many lessons from any given foreign experience, because they may be quite different from the context of the United States. On the question of climate, I think it's a really important question. Jet fuel is a major cost for airlines. It's a major contributor to carbon emissions as well. To me, one of the interesting things about thinking about reforms is how we could imagine a system where we could actually get more service to more places, but simultaneously address some of these concerns. And there's new technologies emerging now, sustainable aviation fuels, the possibility of electric planes that at the moment can fly shorter distances with small numbers of people. But that might be workable to increase access to smaller cities, smaller towns in a way that doesn't massively increase the carbon footprint. I also think and suggest in the book that we think about having a kind of air innovation fund where some of the profits from the good years go into supporting cutting edge R&D in a wide variety of areas, but including on addressing these climate issues.
It still does seem striking that airplanes, while they've become more efficient, are still basically the same as the 60s. I see a question in the way back there.
Yeah, two quick questions. Ganesh, are you on the no-fly list?
I don't think so. I flew earlier today, so.
I called on the wrong guy, didn't I?
My second question is regulatory capitalism, which you've written about other topics. Are there other examples outside of airlines that fit this model of where we think of them as deregulated, but they really shouldn't?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the question was, are there other examples of this kind of other businesses that were sort of like airlines, regulated, maybe deregulated? And the answer is yes. There are a whole bunch of them. In fact, the tradition in America that I talk about in the book, I call it the American tradition of regulated capitalism, was that in these businesses that were not like others, the ones that are more likely to be concentrated, we regulated them differently. And that included transportation, so railroad, and maritime shipping, airlines too, buses, also intercity buses. In the energy sector, electricity, oil and gas pipelines, banking, telecommunications. And what's interesting is in all of these sectors, we had deregulation over the last 40 years. And I think a lot of people would say these sectors have a fair number of problems, to say the least. In the context of COVID, for example, we had real issues with maritime shipping. We had real issues with railroads over the last few years. We had a major financial crisis in 2008. We had a bank failure earlier this year. If you live in Texas or California, you're very familiar with issues with the electricity grid. These are, broadband internet, for example, isn't in rural areas in large parts of this country. So there are lots of problems in all of these sectors too, and I think part of that story is a question of public policy choices. And we could solve some of those problems if we think about making different choices as policymakers.
It does strike me that they're all, in some ways, businesses that are essential to other businesses and tend, as you said, towards concentration or monopoly. Why don't we take one last question, and I'm going to have to go to a faculty meeting. How about this gentleman in the front, too? Seems eager.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have two quick questions. So my first question is that
How about one question, if you don't mind?
Okay. The current problem with the airline industry, do you think it has something more than the airline industry itself? So the monopoly of the airline industry in this country is also due to the absence of a high-speed railway network. and we don't have much option to go to LA, for instance. The only alternative apart from airline is the Greyhound bus, which is not great as well. So do you think to boost up the Amtrak or to have high-speed railway networks can also help us to improve the airline's operation?
So great question. So one of the challenges in thinking about transportation policy is to have an intermodal policy, which just means one that considers the different modes of transportation. And so we used to have really big rail networks, and then as there was more investment in highways and trucking, those competed with rail, and we shifted to a more highway-based system. Thinking about a national transportation strategy that integrates these different modes, I think would be an important step forward for the country, because we would have to ask questions like, should we increase rail between certain sets of cities? Where would that make more sense? How do we think about the intersection between trucking, rail, airlines across the board, just both for passengers and for things like freight and transporting goods? And so I think that's a really important question, and also a policy direction that we need more attention to.
Well, big questions, no time left. Let's join me once again. Let me remind you, I think Ganesh will be signing books. If you're interested in a signed copy of his books, Outside Book Culture has kindly come from the Morningside Heights to sell books here. So join me again in thanking Ganesh for coming to Columbia.